Hi everyone, and welcome back to this week's box office breakdown. So, I'm just gonna start here by breaking down the domestic weekend for February 26th through 28th, and this was a great weekend. So, I'm gonna get here. So, Tom and Jerry made $14.1 million over the weekend, which is pretty insane when you think about it. That might not seem like a huge number, but it is actually a huge number. It's the second biggest opening weekend for the pandemic, only behind Wonder Woman 1984, and that's impressive. I'd also like to point out that it's another Warner Brothers movie. Remember when the industry was like all angry at Warner Brothers for like putting their movies to both streaming on HBO Max and theaters, and yet Warner Brothers is the like only people releasing movies, and they're breaking pandemic box office records multiple times. Like when you think that Warner Brothers took the first step with Tenet, they released it strictly to the theatrical window. It did pretty good overall. Domestic was okay. It's still the highest performing movie domestically. It might be topped by The Croods 2 pretty soon, but worldwide it was great. Once I just want to mention that at the time of Tenet's release, the worldwide box office was a much different place. Movies were able to do better, especially because they had the European markets, which are actually doing solid business, and then COVID outbreaks rose, and that kind of damaged the box office again, which is why Wonder Woman 1984 had such bad legs. That, plus the fact that it was released also on HBO Max, and millions of people watched it there. So, in the end, I think that Wonder Woman 1984 was one of the most watched films released in 2020, even though on the box office level, it kind of disappointed in the end. It's not didn't do terrible by a pandemic standard. It's the third highest grossing movie total behind Tenet and The Croods 2, and it might be topped here soon by Tom and Jerry and Raya and the Last Dragon coming out this coming weekend. But in the end, when you consider the facts, Wonder Woman 1984 was opened in like the worst possible time for a movie to open during the pandemic, since they opened up in September. And so, considering that the fact that it opened to the heights that it did in only about 2.2 thousand theaters, it did well. Its legs were impacted by a lot of factors: the controversy and mixed reviews, the fact that millions of people were watching on HBO Max and they didn't really need to go to see it in theaters, and the fact that COVID outbreaks were much higher at the time of its release, and so that kind of encouraged people to stay indoors and watch it because they had the access. Now that things are starting to clear up and we got a vaccine, I think people are starting to feel more safe. And so we're seeing some solid legs. Wonder Woman 1984 is still in the top 5 with number 4 spot. Staying ahead now of The Marksman with about 700,000 weekend for both of those films, with Wonder Woman 1984 slightly with the edge on top there. It's having some decent holds even as it drops theaters. So in the end, it's looking for about around 45 million, maybe a little bit more at the domestic box office, and about 165 million worldwide. If it releases in some European markets like Germany, France, Spain, and Italy, maybe the UK, but I don't think they're opening until like sometime in May. If it does open in some of the European markets though and does well, I think that it's going to be able to get past 200 million, which would make it a hit. I mean, all it has to do is pass 201 million worldwide to top Birds of Prey. So if it does that, considering the fact that it's in the pandemic, that would be a solid hit. Nowhere near the lengths of Tenet worldwide, but still a solid hit considering the pandemic and because of how well it did on HBO Max. So looking at the number 2 spot, The Croods: A New Age made $1.25 million over its weekend this week, with in its 14th week of release. it had some major competition with Tom and Jerry, but it still had a decent hold, even though it was one of the biggest drops in the top 10. But it's now at 52.4 million, catching up to Tenet. Probably will exceed Tenet's domestic total at some point here, which is impressive. So, just looking down the list, The Little Things is in number 3 with about $930,000. It's so far made about 13 million at the domestic box office, which is actually less in total through its 5-week run so far, less than Tom and Jerry made in its first 3 days. But that's also just showing the strength of Tom and Jerry and the weekend in total, because The Little Things actually had one of the best opening weekends and is having some strongest legs as far as non-tentpole films go. Like, the tentpole films are like the big ones that everybody anticipates. They're like the big blockbusters. But The Little Things is a small scale movie, and it opened with about 4.8 million, which is definitely one of the biggest opening weekends so far. Like, it's definitely, I think it's close to the top 5. But as far as like tentpole movies, the only movies that have been able to get past that have been movies like The New Mutants, Tenet, Wonder Woman 1984, The Croods, etc., Tom and Jerry. And there's quite a few titles that are going to be exceeding that. But yeah, The Little Things is doing well. On the other hand, Warner Brothers' Judas and the Black Messiah cannot say the same. It opened in its opening weekend at the same time that The Little Things was on its third, and it couldn't even, it was like a tie between those films. Like, Judas and the Black Messiah is just not connecting with audiences at the box office. It's only made 4 million total, and it's dropped majorly this weekend again in its third weekend. It's down now. It's barely making more than Monster Hunter, which also opened to about 2 million back in December and has now made 14 million total. The Little Things is going to top Monster Hunter now, and I'm actually glad about that. I haven't seen Monster Hunter, but I just think The Little Things deserves it more, even though I've heard they're both bad movies. But it also just shows the strength of Warner Brothers' plan of the theatrical and HBO Max hybrid release. It's showing, because they have 4 films in the top 10, and they seem to be like the only studio that's had the guts to release a movie in theaters. Like, everybody was so angry about the fact that they were doing this release plan with streaming and theaters, but now they're like breaking all these records for the pandemic. Like, Warner Brothers started out in September with Tenet, and so far that is the #1 domestic film of the pandemic. But since then, in opening weekend, Warner Brothers has topped that number with now Tom and Jerry and Wonder Woman 1984, and The Croods 2 also topped Tenet in opening weekend and probably will top it in the end at the domestic box office. And that's what I want to end here about the domestic box office, is The Croods is pretty much the only release that wasn't Warner Brothers that actually became a hit. We have Warner Brothers' Tenet, Wonder Woman 1984, and now Tom and Jerry. Among those movies, the big pandemic films, The Croods 2 is like the only movie that has been able to do that. And that movie was strictly to the theatrical window. It did open early access to like rentals, online rentals and stuff, and it's been existing in both worlds pretty well. So it's definitely a financial hit. It is impressive how well The Croods 2 is doing. It had a decent international run with the markets that it was able to open in. And so Universal has been releasing some smaller films as well. They are the only other studio outside of Warner Brothers that are having the gut to do anything until this coming weekend. I mean, Disney kind of released a movie with The New Mutants opening in late August, and that didn't do terrible, but like, it was time for that movie to come out. Like, they weren't doing anything bold. They knew it was going to be a flop, and by releasing it in the pandemic, when people were kind of hungry for movies, and releasing it as one of the first movies of the pandemic, it actually didn't do terrible. It like is still very low in terms of both how much it made, and even comparable to the bigger hits. Tom and Jerry is probably going to exceed The New Mutants within a week or two. And so, like, Disney hasn't done much for the box office. I'm going to be breaking that down of why that's changing this week. But overall, yeah, the domestic box office was impressive this week. It is definitely showing that people are feeling a lot more safe with the vaccinations and that family movies are doing significantly well. I'm not sure how well Tom and Jerry is going to have legs, how long its legs are going to be, but considering it's a family film, I think it probably will do pretty well. I'm just going to go to the worldwide box office here. So I want to break down the fact of China and just where Tom and Jerry sits. As of now, Tom and Jerry had a decent international opening with around 26 million. So its opening weekend worldwide was close to 40 million, which isn't bad at all. Within the coming weeks, I can definitely see it breaking into the number 4 spot on the worldwide chart, until the fact that if it wasn't for the fact that Raya was coming the week after, I think that's going to have a huge opening both domestically and worldwide. It's not going to be anywhere like near what we would typically see, but for a pandemic, it's going to be huge, and I'm going to be breaking that down. So, Detective Chinatown 3 and Hi Mom are huge hits in China. China has had a lot of huge hits. They were starting to show major growth in 2020, and now in 2021, they have a lot of huge films. Like most of the films that we see in the 2021 list of worldwide are China films, and like Writer's Odyssey, Bonnie Bears, and Endgame, Naja Reborn. A lot of hits in China. The biggest ones being Hi Mom and Detective Chinatown 3, like I said. Detective Chinatown 3 opened bigger than Avengers Endgame, but considering the fact that how many people live in China, that was bound to happen eventually. But yeah, China is becoming competitive as far as single markets go. But in the end, it's not going to make as much in China as Endgame made domestically. It might not even make as much as Black Panther did, but I think it will just quite slightly get past 700 million. Hi Mom, on the other hand, is in its third week. It made about 53 million, and it's already exceeded Detective Chinatown 3. It is becoming a huge hit. It probably will make it past 800 million. But yeah, China's weekends are being going pretty incredible, to be honest. Like, they're huge. And yeah, China is doing well. I think that's kind of where domestic markets will be by 2022. I think Jurassic World 3, as well as a lot of decently anticipated Marvel films are going to be coming out. They won't reach like 600 million. I mean, Jurassic World 3 has the potential to, but I think that the box office will be back to normal, and so we're going to be seeing huge numbers like this again by 2022. It's going to be a slow recovery, but Tom and Jerry proved that there is recovery. So yeah, that's what I have to break down with the box office. It's doing well. Now, I just want to say, for Raya and the Last Dragon, it's going to be big this weekend. I am going to predict it now. Raya and the Last Dragon is going to do extremely well. And there's quite a few factors into that. The main factor being its reviews are great. Its review embargo lifted. It's now at 79 reviews at a 95%. That's like close to Moana reviews. I'm not sure if it's going to maintain that. It has 100% with top critics. So, and it's just like one review away from getting that certified fresh score. And I think it will stay in the 90s as it goes along. So the reviews are definitely going to help it. It's going to help it top Tom and Jerry's opening weekend and even Wonder Woman 1984. I'm going to do a segment about where I think it's going to land, but right now I just want to talk about why I think it's going to be the biggest hit. Also, the fact that the box office is recovering. There's been a lot more COVID vaccinations, and so with that, with the COVID vaccinations, Raya and the Last Dragon is going to be opening in a movie theater environment, like I've mentioned, that is more comfortable going to the theaters than they were back in December. and so that's going to definitely help this movie, which would definitely be a competitor for one of the biggest hits of 2021. It's going to help it compete against Wonder Woman 1984's number one pandemic opening weekend. So, yeah. So I've covered reviews. The pandemic is starting to clear up. It's going to be opening in more theaters. The fact that it's a family film. We've been seeing with The Croods 2 and Tom and Jerry that family films are doing pretty solid. And it's a Disney movie. It's not just a family film. This is a Disney family film. Also, I think it has an upper hand on Warner Brothers movies because of the fact that it's in theaters and on streaming, but it's streaming with Premier Access with a $30 fee. I think it will do better with Premier Access than Mulan did, even with it being released in theaters like simultaneously, because there's like not really much controversy surrounding this. There was so much controversy and like backlash and everything surrounding Mulan, which kind of like shot that film down. That film should have been like one of the biggest Hollywood films in China, like the biggest American made Hollywood film in China, and it barely made anything. Like Wonder Woman 1984 did pretty bad in China. It did okay in the rest of the world, but China was bad. Mulan really did not much better. Like it was like a $1 million difference. So Mulan was huge flop. I think it did better on Disney's Premier Access than it did in the international box office. They really should have allowed for it to be released in theaters at the same time, and they're correcting that mistake with Raya. Disney really should have released Mulan in theaters at the same time to kind of help the box office a little bit, to help movie theaters, and they are righting those wrongs with Raya here. I think it's going to have a pretty big opening because of that. Because it's not free on streaming, a lot of people I think are going to go to the theaters rather than pay $30, which with Wonder Woman 1984 and even Tom and Jerry, they wouldn't do that as they wouldn't be as likely to do that because they can watch it for free with a subscription to HBO Max. And I know quite a few people that I have as friends who borrowed HBO Max and watched Wonder Woman 1984. So a lot of people watched that film because of how cheaply accessible it was. It definitely boosted the subscriber count, but that also did allow for a lot more people to be sharing the account. So with Raya, people have to pay for it. So there might be sharing of accounts and sharing of the Premier Access, but they still have to pay for it. And I think that that's going to push a lot more people to movie theaters, even though the $30 price tag, I guess, isn't terrible, especially for a movie like Raya, with how big this movie is becoming among critics and probably will be among audiences. It will be also competing against WandaVision, the season finale. Not quite sure why Disney didn't just release this a week later, but in the end, it's going to be big. So this coming weekend, Raya and the Last Dragon is going to be released, and I think it's going to be pretty big. So in a regular box office environment, I think this film would make about $70 million opening weekend, $240 million domestic total, $550 million international, for a worldwide total of $790 million. I think this is going to be a big hit internationally, especially in China and places like South Korea. So I did think that it would kind of like fall quite short domestically of the box office of Moana. But I think that it would have been close, and because of how big the reviews are, and just like where Disney is at a point in dominating the market, I think that it could have topped Moana, but very slightly, at least at the domestic. Worldwide, it definitely, I think, would have beaten Moana. But on a pandemic level, I think this movie would typically make about $15 million in opening weekend, but have strong legs and make $65 million domestic. Now, I did take into consideration the fact that it's going to be on Premier Access, so I did factor that into its pandemic prediction. I think it would make about 150 million international for a 215 million worldwide total. And that's like, I made this prediction during the time that Wonder Woman 1984 was released, during December, when things were kind of slowing down, cases were rising. That's what most of these pandemic predictions are. They're like the low note level, like how low this movie could have possibly performed. So now to where I think this movie is going to end up. I think that even with Premiere Access, it's going to have a 20 million opening this coming weekend. I might be wrong, but I think it can pull it off. It can top Wonder Woman 1984, because I think that not as many people are going to be watching it on streaming, and so they are going to be watching it in theaters. It's not going to top Wonder Woman by much opening weekend, but it will do it enough that, at the box office anyway, that it definitely will be a big hit, considerably big hit in the theaters, and will definitely show more improvement for the theatrical market. More improvement is good. It's showing health in the box office environment, and that we are going to be having a recovery. If it doesn't perform better than Tom and Jerry, then the box office has a huge problem. I'd say if this kind of a movie can't beat it, especially since both movies are on streaming, I just don't see any way this movie could fall below Tom and Jerry. Like, if Tom and Jerry had matched my prediction of a 6 million or even a 10 million, honestly, my original 10 million prediction that I was going to do, but then kind of chickened out because of the fact that I didn't really think that it would top The Croods opening weekend, but then it did. But now that also sets a pretty high bar for Raya, but I think it can do it because, once again, both films are on streaming and in theaters, and Raya is for an extra cost. So I think a lot more people are going to be hard-pressed to go to the theaters. Even if it's not a huge majority of people, it will be enough to get to number one for the pandemic, and its legs will be solid. Croods has had great legs. A lot of films during the pandemic, a lot of the smaller films have had pretty good legs. I think this film is going to make about 90 million domestic total. If it's lucky, if things really start to clear up, maybe even get to 100 million. But right now I'm going to play it a little bit safe with 90 million, because so far no film has even topped 60 million yet. But I think this is going to be pretty big internationally, because China has recovered so well and other Asian markets are doing well. I think this movie is going to do about 300 million international, and I'm not quite sure with European markets how that's going to factor in. I think it can hit 300 million without the European markets, and worldwide that would put it at 390 million, which would put it past Tenet for the biggest hit of the pandemic, both domestically and worldwide, showing that finally Disney is doing something about the current condition. They're not being selfish, I'm going to say, like they were with Milan, and that backfired. So now Raya and the Last Dragon is a very good move, both streaming with Premiere Access and at the box office. It's going to be a pretty decent hit. I can feel it. If it doesn't become the biggest hit, let's say it makes 16 million opening, it's still pretty good, and it will probably outleg the majority of the movies that have come out so far. So even if it doesn't meet my prediction, it probably will be the biggest domestic hit and one of the biggest worldwide hits, and will kind of further show Disney's dominance in a way. But Disney also has to look out, because March is a huge month, and Godzilla and Kong are coming after you, Disney. Hashtag Snyder Cut. Thanks everyone for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me what you think about the box office, if you think it's going to make a fast or a slow recovery. Thanks everyone once again for watching. Please hit that notification bell to help you be on the lookout for more videos from Luke Film Boss, and I'll see you all later.